This 4-year-old street urchin finds a millionaire trapped inside a burning car, but she grabs a piece of wood and does something that shocks everyone. Comment with a rating from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The smell of smoke sliced through the air of the sprawling metropolis like a razor, mingling with the exhaust fumes of cars cruising down Main Street. The little girl, 4 years old and as fragile as a wounded sparrow, walked the bustling sidewalks with hesitant steps. Her small body was so slight that any distracted person might think she was only 2. Her huge eyes, disproportionate to her thin face, constantly scanned the ground, searching for a forgotten coin or a scrap of food to quell the hunger that had gnawed at her stomach for days. The tattered, dirty clothes hung loosely on her small shoulders, highlighting the malnutrition that had become her constant companion. Her bare feet, calloused and bruised, knew every uneven stone on the sidewalk, every pothole in the asphalt where water collected after the rain. The girl had learned early on that the street didn't forgive the weak, and even as just a child, she already carried in her eyes a bitter wisdom that shouldn't exist in someone so young. The deafening noise of traffic was the constant backdrop to her existence. Heavy trucks honked impatiently, motorcycles weaved between cars with dangerous speed, and hurried pedestrians passed her by as if she were invisible. A few glanced with pity, others with disdain, but most simply moved on, absorbed in their own worries and commitments. The little girl had stopped in front of a trash can when a metallic roar echoed through the street, followed by the screech of brakes slammed on hard. The noise was so intense that even the most distracted passers-by stopped to look. A luxury car, black and gleaming, had lost control and collided violently with a lamppost. The impact was so strong that the metal twisted, creating a macabre symphony of crushed iron and shattered glass. What happened next transformed the accident into something even more terrifying. Sparks began to fly from the damaged engine, and in a matter of seconds, orange flames began to lick at the car's body. The fire spread with frightening speed, fueled by the fuel leaking from the punctured tank. Inside the car, a male figure thrashed desperately. The man, who appeared to be around 30 years old, had striking features reminiscent of a movie star. Even in the midst of despair, it was impossible not to notice his natural good looks. A defined jawline, perfectly cut dark hair, and a bearing that betrayed someone accustomed to luxury and power. His expensive clothes, an impeccable Italian suit, were now stained with blood and torn by the impact. The seatbelt had locked with the force of the collision, keeping him prisoner in the driver's seat as the flames approached dangerously. His movements were frenzied, his hands fighting against the defective mechanism as panic took over his eyes. Desperate screams echoed from inside the vehicle, mingling with the sinister crackle of the fire that was progressively consuming the car. The pedestrians who had stopped to watch the scene began to move away, seized by the fear of a possible explosion. Some took out their cell phones to film, others shouted for help, but no one approached close enough to attempt a rescue. The intense heat of the flames created an invisible barrier that kept everyone at a safe distance, everyone except one person. The street urchin, who had witnessed everything from the moment of impact, watched the scene with an intensity that contrasted with her age. While the adults recoiled in fear, she took a step forward. Something in her small chest constricted at the sight of the despair in the trapped man's eyes. It was a strange feeling, a compulsion she couldn't explain. Perhaps pure empathy, or simply the inability to stand by and watch someone suffer. Her big eyes quickly scanned the surroundings, looking for something that could help. That's when she saw it. A piece of wood, probably part of a nearby construction site, lying in the gutter. Without hesitation, the little girl ran over and picked up the wood with her fragile little hands. The wood was too heavy for her, but the adrenaline gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. With determination that would surprise any adult present, The girl headed to the burning car. The heat was intense, making her delicate skin tingle, but she didn't stop. She raised the piece of wood with difficulty, and with all the force that her little body could muster, struck the passenger side window. The first blow only cracked the glass. The second produced a web of fissures. On the third, finally, the glass shattered completely, falling into sharp pieces that injured her delicate little hands. Blood trickled down her small fingers, mixing with the accumulated dirt, but she didn't seem to notice the pain. Through the opening created, the girl was able to reach the inside door handle and open the door. The flames had already taken over the front of the vehicle, and time was running out quickly. With agile movements, she climbed onto the passenger seat and began to fight against the locked seatbelt that was keeping the man prisoner. The millionaire, semi-conscious due to the impact, opened his eyes and was confronted with the child's dirty face leaning over him. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. How was it possible that such a small and fragile girl was there, trying to save him while dozens of adults watched from afar? With small but determined fingers, the girl finally managed to release the belt mechanism. The man collapsed on top of her, his weight much greater than she could bear, but she didn't give up. Using all her strength, she managed to drag him out of the vehicle just as the flames began to invade the driver's compartment. Both fell onto the hot asphalt, she underneath him, almost suffocated by the weight. The man had fainted completely, but he was breathing. The girl, exhausted and injured, looked at the car that was now completely consumed by the fire and felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion take over her small body. That's when she heard the sound of sirens approaching, and her last vision before also passing out was of red and blue lights flashing against the orange sky of the great metropolis's twilight. The smell of disinfectant and medicine hung in the air of the hospital when the millionaire slowly opened his eyes. The white light of the ceiling momentarily blinded him, making him blink several times before his vision adjusted to the environment. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and he could taste the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He tried to move, but a sharp pain in his chest made him groan softly. "Easy there, sir," said a female voice beside him. It was a middle-aged nurse, with grey hair pulled back into a bun and gentle eyes behind her glasses. "You've been in a bad accident. You have some fractured ribs and a mild concussion, but you're very lucky." The businessman tried to organize his confused thoughts. Fragments of memory slowly returned. The meeting that had lasted all morning, the rush to get to the next appointment, the tire that blew out on the curve, and then the fire. He vaguely remembered the flames, the despair, the feeling of being trapped as the temperature rose dangerously around him. How did I get out of the car?" he murmured, his voice hoarse and weak. The nurse smiled, adjusting the IV that was slowly dripping into his arm. "That's an incredible story, sir. You were saved by a child. A very small girl broke the window of your car and managed to get you out of there before it was too late." The words echoed in his mind like a distant echo. A child. It didn't make sense. He was a big, heavy man, and he was unconscious. How could a child have managed? "Where is she?" he asked, trying to sit up in the hospital bed. "In the next room," replied the nurse, her expression becoming more serious. She was also injured. Nothing serious, just some cuts on her hands from the broken glass, but, well, she was very malnourished and dehydrated. Doctors believe she's been living on the streets for quite some time. The businessman closed his eyes, trying to process the information. In recent years, since he had completely taken control of the technology company he had inherited from his father, he had become increasingly isolated from the real world. He spent his days between luxurious offices, meetings in air-conditioned rooms, and dinners in expensive restaurants. The idea that there were children living on the streets of the city he passed through daily in his car with tinted windows was something that rarely crossed his mind. "Can I see her?" he asked. The nurse hesitated for a moment. "Well, She's sleeping, but I suppose it's okay. The doctor said you could get up for a few minutes if you feel well." With the nurse's help, he managed to sit on the edge of the bed. His legs trembled slightly, but he managed to stand. Wearing only the hospital gown and leaning against the wall, he walked slowly to the next room. What he saw left him speechless. The girl was lying in a bed that seemed gigantic for her tiny body. She was even smaller than he had imagined, so small and fragile that she could easily be mistaken for a 2-year-old child. Her hair, now clean, was light brown and formed soft curls around her angelic face. Her little hands were bandaged due to the cuts, and there was an IV in her thin little arm. Even sleeping, she didn't seem completely relaxed. Her eyelids trembled occasionally, as if she were having restless dreams, and her small fists clenched and unclenched at regular intervals. There was a tension in her face that shouldn't exist in such a young child, a watchfulness that persisted even in sleep. The businessman carefully approached the bed, observing the child who had risked her own life to save him. It didn't make sense. Why would an abandoned girl, who clearly had nothing in life, risk everything for a stranger? The cold, calculating logic that guided his business couldn't find a rational explanation for that selfless act of courage. "She came here covered in dirt and wearing clothes that looked more like rags," said the nurse, who had followed him to the room. "But when the doctors examined her, they discovered something interesting. Despite all the neglect and malnutrition, she shows no signs of physical abuse. That's rare in street children." The man nodded absent-mindedly, his eyes fixed on the girl's peaceful face. There was something about her that awakened a strange feeling in his chest, a mixture of gratitude, protection, and something deeper that he couldn't identify. "What's going to happen to her now?" he asked. "Well, social workers have been called. She'll probably be sent to some temporary institution while they try to locate family members or a foster family." The nurse paused, observing the worried expression on the businessman's face. "Why do you ask?" He didn't answer immediately. An idea was forming in his mind, something impulsive and completely out of his usual character. For years he had made decisions based only on risk analyses, profit projections, and market strategies. His life was orderly, predictable, controlled. But that child had done something that no adult around him had been able to do. She had acted without thinking about the consequences, moved only by compassion. "I want to adopt her," he said suddenly, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. The nurse blinked several times, clearly shocked. "Sir, you've just been in a serious accident. Maybe it's not the best time to make such important decisions." "She saved my life," he interrupted, his tone making it clear that it wasn't a decision made on the spur of the moment. "I have resources, a big house, the means to give her everything she needs. And more importantly than that, I owe it to her." The girl stirred slightly in the bed, turning her head in their direction. Her big eyes opened slowly, still clouded by sleep and medication. When she saw him standing next to her bed, her eyes widened slightly, but there was no fear there, just cautious curiosity. "Hi," she said in a small, hoarse voice. "Hi," he replied, crouching down to get closer to her height. "How are you feeling?" "My hands hurt a little," she admitted, looking at the bandages, "but the doctor said they'll heal soon." "Do you remember what happened?" She nodded solemnly. "Your car was on fire. You were shouting." She paused, her big eyes fixed on his face. "Are you okay now?" The simple and genuine question moved him more than he expected. "I'm okay thanks to you. You were very brave." A small smile appeared on the girl's lips, completely transforming her face. "My mom always said we should help people when they need it." "Where is your mom now?" he asked gently. The smile disappeared and she looked down. "She's been gone for a long time. I don't know where." The businessman felt a pang in his chest, not from his fractured ribs, but for the heart. He looked at that extraordinary child and made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "Would you like to come live with me?" he asked, his voice gentle but determined. "I have a big house with a yard where you could play. And you'd never have to worry about food or a place to sleep again." The girl's eyes widened again, this time with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Really? Really?" he confirmed. "If you want to." She was quiet for a long moment, as if she were processing the enormity of the proposal. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I would like that," she whispered. At that moment, neither he nor the child could imagine that this decision would trigger a series of events that would test not only their mutual gratitude, but also their ability to face adversities that were yet to come. The mansion stood majestically against the blue afternoon sky, its white walls contrasting with the perfectly manicured gardens that stretched for acres. Wrought iron gates guarded the main entrance, and a marble fountain adorned the center of the circular courtyard where luxury cars used to park. It was a world completely different from anything the little girl had ever known. Sitting on the leather seat of the imported car, she pressed her face against the window, watching with wide eyes the grandeur that revealed itself with every meter. Her still bandaged little hands left small marks on the glass as she tried to absorb every detail of that place that would be her new home. The millionaire drove in silence, occasionally looking in the rearview mirror to observe the child's reaction. 3 days had passed since they left the hospital, enough time for the temporary adoption papers to be processed and for him to organize some basic details. He had bought children's clothes, toys, and everything he imagined a 4-year-old girl might need. But now, seeing her expression of admiration mixed with apprehension, he wondered if he had made the right choices. "It's very big," murmured the girl, her small voice echoing in the luxurious interior of the vehicle. "You'll get used to it," he replied, trying to sound reassuring. "And there's plenty of room to play." When the car stopped in front of the main entrance, the mansion door opened even before they got out. An elegant woman emerged, her high heels echoing rhythmically on the polished marble of the porch. She appeared to be 40 years old, but her beauty was meticulously maintained, perfectly styled blonde hair, impeccable makeup, and a dress that cost more than many people earned in a year. The businessman's stepmother watched him with an expression that mixed feigned concern with something much darker hidden behind her glacial blue eyes. She had married his father only 2 years before the patriarch's passing, enough time to secure a comfortable position in the family, but not enough to feel truly secure about her inheritance. "Darling," she said, her voice as sweet as artificial honey, "I'm so glad you made it home safe and sound." "I was so worried about the accident." Her eyes flickered to the child who had gotten out of the car and was now hiding timidly behind the businessman's legs. "And this must be the girl." The slightly disdainful tone with which she uttered the last word did not go unnoticed by the millionaire, but he chose to ignore it. "Yes, she's going to live with us from now on." The stepmother forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course. How noble of you to take in a child in need." She bent down slightly, extending a cold hand towards the girl. "Hello, dear. Welcome to our home." The little girl shrank even further behind the businessman, her childish instincts picking up something unpleasant in the woman in front of her. There was something in the way she smiled, in the coldness of her eyes, that made the girl remember dangerous people she had met on the streets. "She's still adjusting," explained the millionaire, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "It was very difficult for her." "Naturally," agreed the stepmother, her smile becoming even more forced. "I'm sure that with time she'll feel at home." They entered the mansion and the girl was speechless at what she saw. The entrance hall was larger than any place she had ever been, with a crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling and curved marble staircases leading to the second floor. Expensive paintings decorated the walls, and antique furniture of polished wood occupied the spaces with studied elegance. "I've prepared the pink room on the second floor," announced the stepmother, her voice echoing in the spacious area. I thought it would be appropriate for a girl. Again that tone, as if the word left a bad taste in her mouth. The businessman frowned slightly, but decided that perhaps he was being paranoid. After all, his stepmother had always been a sophisticated woman, accustomed to a certain standard of living. It was natural that the presence of a street child would cause some initial discomfort. Climbing the stairs, the girl held firmly to the millionaire's hand, her small feet sinking into the soft carpet. Each step took her further away from the world she knew and closer to a reality that seemed too good to be true. The room that the stepmother had prepared was a demonstration of wealth that bordered on exaggeration. Light pink walls, ornate white furniture, a canopy bed that seemed to have come straight out of a fairy tale, and expensive toys scattered in a calculatedly casual manner. There were porcelain dolls, miniature dollhouses, and a closet full of dresses that cost more than many families spent in a month. "What do you think?" asked the businessman, anxiously observing the girl's reaction. She walked slowly through the room, touching the objects delicately as if she were afraid of breaking them. "It's very beautiful," she said finally, but her voice carried a hesitation that he couldn't interpret. The truth was that the girl felt lost in that world of luxury. On the streets, she had learned to sleep anywhere, to be content with any food, to value the simplest things. That excess of wealth intimidated her more than it comforted her. "I'll let you get settled in," said the stepmother, still with that cold smile. "Dinner will be served at 8. I hope our young guest has good table manners." After she left, the businessman knelt down next to the girl. "Are you okay? You seem worried." The child looked at him with her big, honest eyes. "The lady didn't like me." The girl's sharp perception surprised him. "Why do you say that?" "She smiles, but her eyes don't smile too," she explained, with the brutal simplicity of children. "Like some people on the streets who pretended to be kind." The comment planted a seed of unease in the millionaire's chest, but he tried to brush it aside. Perhaps the girl was just being cautious due to her past experiences. The following weeks brought a strange routine for both of them. The businessman, used to spending most of his time at the office, began to come home earlier, eager to see how the girl was adapting. She was a quiet, observant child who seemed to absorb every detail of her new environment with an intelligence that impressed him. He enrolled her in a nearby private school, bought children's books, and hired a tutor to help her adapt to the formal educational environment. The girl was curious and studious, asking questions that sometimes caught him off guard with their depth. But there were times when he found her standing in front of the windows, looking at the garden, with a melancholic expression that broke his heart. When he asked what she was thinking, she always replied that she was fine, but he realized that the transition wasn't as easy as he had hoped. During the day, while he worked, the girl stayed with the housekeepers. The older staff, especially the cook and the housekeeper, had quickly become fond of the child, impressed by her natural politeness and gratitude for everything. But he began to notice that whenever his stepmother was present, the maids became more tense and the girl became quieter. One afternoon, arriving earlier than usual, he overheard voices coming from the living room. Approaching silently, he recognized his stepmother's voice speaking on the phone. "No, I don't understand what he was thinking," she was saying, her voice laden with barely disguised irritation. "Bringing a street kid home like that, out of the blue. It's obvious this is going to cause problems." There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. "Of course I'm worried about her," the stepmother continued, but the sarcastic tone suggested otherwise. "But you have to understand my position. I've built a life here, I have my plans, and now suddenly there's a child in the middle of it all." The businessman felt the blood run cold in his veins. He stood frozen, listening to a conversation that revealed a side of his stepmother that he had never seen so clearly. "I can't do anything obvious," she continued, "but I'm sure that with time, he'll realize it was a mistake. Kids like that always bring problems." Criminal relatives will show up or she'll cause some scandal. It's only a matter of time. At that moment, he heard small footsteps coming down the stairs. The girl appeared, wearing one of the expensive dresses he had bought, but which somehow seemed too big on her still thin little body. She saw him standing in the hallway and smiled, a genuine smile full of affection that contrasted drastically with the cold smiles of his stepmother. "You're home early today," she said, approaching him. "Yes," he replied, still processing what he had heard. "I wanted to see how your day was." "It was good. The housekeeper taught me how to make cookies," she said, animated. "Do you want to try one?" Looking at that innocent child who had risked her life to save him and was now trying so hard to adapt to a completely new world, he felt a mixture of protectiveness and determination grow in his chest. No matter what his stepmother thought or planned, he would not allow anything bad to happen to the girl. But what he didn't realize was that the conversation he had overheard was just the tip of the iceberg, and that the silent war for the soul of that house was just beginning. The first signs that something was wrong began subtly, like small cracks in a wall that go unnoticed until the whole structure collapses. The girl had been in the mansion for almost a month when she began to realize that her life there wasn't as simple as it seemed on the surface. It all started with small, seemingly innocent incidents. One morning, coming down for breakfast, she found her glass of milk spilled on the table, creating a white puddle that ran to the marble floor. The stepmother was there, observing the scene with an expression of studied disapproval. "Oh dear," she said in a voice that dripped false concern. "You need to be more careful. This marble is imported and very expensive. Stains can be permanent." The girl looked confused at the glass. She was sure that she had left everything tidy the night before, as she always did. She had learned on the streets to be extremely careful with her few possessions, and this habit had intensified in the mansion, where each object seemed worth more than she could imagine. "I didn't spill it," she said softly, but her voice was muffled by the arrival of the businessman, who was coming down the stairs, adjusting his tie. "Good morning, little one," he said, kissing her forehead. "Did you sleep well?" "Good morning," she replied, deciding not to mention the spilled milk when she saw the stepmother's warning look. But the incidents multiplied. Her clothes inexplicably appeared dirty or torn. Expensive toys were found broken in her room, always when she wasn't around. The stepmother was always present at these discoveries, sighing with theatrical regret and commenting on how children needed to learn to take care of their things. "Perhaps she needs more supervision," suggested the stepmother one afternoon, as the businessman observed a broken crystal vase on the floor of the girl's room. Children who come from difficult environments sometimes have destructive behaviors. The little girl listened to everything in silence, her big eyes filling with tears that she struggled to contain. She knew that she hadn't broken the vase, just as she hadn't spilled the milk or torn her clothes. But how could she prove it? And why would someone do these things and then blame her? The businessman, in turn, found himself torn between guilt and confusion. He had spent most of his adult life focused solely on business, mergers and acquisitions, stock market investments, and capital expansion. His net worth in dollars grew steadily. His financial investments were diversified between traditional stocks and even cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, but when it came to understanding the behavior of a 4-year-old child, he felt completely lost. "Maybe it's normal," he thought, watching the girl play quietly in her room. Adaptation can be difficult, and she lived on the streets for so long, but there was something in her eyes that bothered him. The spontaneous joy that he had seen in the early days was gradually disappearing, replaced by a caution that painfully reminded him of how she had come to them. A child who had learned too early to distrust the world around her. It was during a Thursday afternoon that the situation took a more serious turn. The businessman had arrived home early from the office, eager to spend some time with the girl before dinner. He found the house in a stir, with the stepmother gesturing dramatically in the living room while two maids cleaned up shards of porcelain from the floor. "What happened?" he asked, observing the remains of what had clearly been an antique and extremely valuable tea set. "It was terrible," said the stepmother, bringing a hand to her chest as if she were on the verge of an attack. "I was trying to teach our little guest good table manners, you know, how to properly use fine china, and then, well, she knocked everything over." The businessman looked around, searching for the girl. "Where is she?" "In her room, of course. I sent her there immediately." The stepmother sighed deeply. "Darling, I know you have good intentions, but maybe we need to consider that she's simply not ready for this kind of environment." Something in the stepmother's tone set off an alarm in the businessman's mind. He ran up the stairs quickly and found the girl sitting on the floor of her room, hugging her knees to her chest. Her cheeks were wet with tears, and she was rocking slightly back and forth, a behavior he had never seen before. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling next to her. "What happened downstairs?" The girl raised her red eyes to him. "I didn't break anything," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I swear I didn't. Tell me what happened." "The lady called me to the room and said she was going to teach me about fancy tea," explained the girl, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her dress. "I was sitting quietly with my hands in my lap like she told me to. And then she knocked everything over and started yelling that I had made a mess." The businessman felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you sure?" "I swear," repeated the girl, her big eyes fixed on his face with desperate intensity. "I didn't even touch the cups. She did it on purpose and then said it was me." For a long moment they were silent. The businessman studied the child's face, looking for signs of lying, but all he saw was raw honesty and a growing fear of not being believed. "Why would she do that?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "Because she doesn't like me," replied the girl simply. "She wants me to leave." The simplicity of the answer hit him like a punch to the stomach. For weeks, he had tried to rationalize the strange behaviors he observed, convincing himself that they were just normal adaptation difficulties. But now, looking at that child who had saved his life and was asking only to be loved and accepted, he began to see the situation with terrifying clarity. That night, during dinner, he carefully observed the interactions between his stepmother and the girl. What he saw made him sick. The stepmother spoke to the child in a sweet and affectionate tone, but there was a coldness in her eyes that was impossible to ignore when you knew what to look for. Every "dear" and "my sweet" sounded false, as if the words left a bitter taste in her mouth. The girl, in turn, responded with forced politeness, her shoulders tense and her eyes constantly alert. It was like watching a small animal in the presence of a predator, never completely relaxed, always ready to flee. "Darling," said the stepmother during dessert, "I've been thinking perhaps it would be good for our little guest to spend some time with specialized professionals. There are wonderful institutions that know how to deal with children who come from difficult circumstances." "No," he replied immediately, his voice firmer than he intended. The stepmother blinked, surprised by the vehemence of his response. "But, darling, you have to think about what's best for her. Clearly she's struggling to adapt here. Maybe she needs more specialized care." "I said no," he repeated, looking directly into her eyes. "She's staying here. This is her home now." He saw something dark pass across the stepmother's face before she recomposed her expression into a mask of caring concern. "Of course, darling, you know what's best." But the businessman could feel that the war had been officially declared. Until now, the stepmother's attacks had been subtle, designed to make the girl seem problematic in his eyes. Now that he had made it clear that he wouldn't get rid of the child easily, he suspected that the tactics would become more aggressive. After dinner, he found the girl in her room, leafing through a book of fairy tales that he had bought for her. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched as she touched the colored pages delicately. "You know that I believe you, don't you?" he said gently. She looked up, hope shining in her depths. "You do. I do. And I want you to know that this is your home. No one is going to take you away from here." The girl threw herself into his arms, hugging him with surprising strength for someone so small. "I promise to be good," she whispered against his chest. "I promise not to cause problems." "You're not causing problems," he murmured, stroking her hair. "You're perfect just the way you are." But even as he consoled her, a part of his mind was already working, planning. His technology company had thrived because he learned to identify threats before they became critical. He had a considerable net worth, with diversified investments in international stocks, and even a small fortune in bitcoins, held as a hedge against economic volatility. Now he would need to use that same strategic skill to protect something much more valuable than any amount in dollars or euros that he possessed. The safety and happiness of a child who had saved his life, and in the process had saved his soul as well. The battle for the soul of that house was just beginning, and he was determined to win, no matter the cost. After all, he had learned in business that sometimes you need to invest everything in something to protect what really matters. But what he didn't know was that his stepmother was also a skilled strategist, and that her next moves would be much more dangerous than anything she had tried so far. The change in the dynamics of the house became palpable in the weeks that followed. The businessman, now aware of his stepmother's veiled hostility, began to observe every interaction with a detective's eye. He hired a specialized nanny to look after the girl during the day, claiming he wanted to ensure she received proper educational attention, but actually creating a witness to any suspicious behavior. The little girl, in turn, seemed to flourish with the extra attention and the more evident protection. She began to laugh more easily, to ask curious questions about how his companies worked, and even to draw pictures of the mansion where she now felt safer. Her drawings always included two large figures, herself and the businessman, but noticeably never included the stepmother. The older woman, realizing that her direct tactics were not working, changed her strategy. If she couldn't make the girl seem problematic through fabricated incidents, she would try a different approach: social isolation and psychological sabotage. "Darling," she said one morning, serving coffee with studied elegance, "I've been talking to some friends from society, and they are eager to meet our young guest." The businessman looked up from his financial reports. He had spent the early morning analyzing fluctuations in the stock market, worried about some cryptocurrency investments that were showing unexpected volatility. His net worth in diversified investments normally reassured him, but lately his mind was more focused on the emotional security of the girl than on financial security. "What kind of gathering?" he asked cautiously. "Oh, nothing formal. Just an afternoon tea with some of the most prominent families in the neighborhood. It would be good for her to start making friends with children of her new social class." There was something in the stepmother's tone that made him uncomfortable, but on the surface the suggestion seemed reasonable. The girl really needed friends her age, and he had worried about her spending so much time alone in the mansion. "All right," he agreed, "but I want the nanny to accompany her." A flash of irritation passed through the stepmother's eyes before she smiled. "Of course, darling. How protective of you." The following Saturday, the mansion was prepared to receive visitors. The stepmother had organized everything meticulously: elegant tables in the garden, fine china, expensive flower arrangements, and a menu of sophisticated appetizers that looked more like edible works of art. It was a spectacle of wealth designed to impress. The guests arrived promptly at 3 in the afternoon. They were women of high society, dressed in designer clothes and carrying purses that cost more than many people earned in months. Their children accompanied them, well-dressed and visibly spoiled children who looked like miniature adults. The girl was presented wearing one of the most expensive dresses that the businessman had bought for her, but even so, she seemed out of place in the middle of that group. Her posture was more reserved, her manners simpler, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of experiences that those other children would never have. "This is our little protégée," announced the stepmother with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She had a very different life before coming to live with us." The other women observed her with a mixture of curiosity and something that seemed more pity than genuine acceptance. One of them, a tall redhead with exaggerated jewelry, leaned in to whisper something in the hostess's ear, provoking muffled giggles. "Dear," said the stepmother to the girl, "why don't you go play with the other children while we chat?" There were 4 other children present, all appearing to be between 4 and 6 years old, dressed like little models, and with an arrogance that they had clearly learned by observing their parents. They looked at the girl with a mixture of curiosity and barely disguised superiority. "Did you really live on the street?" asked a boy with perfectly combed blonde hair, his voice filled with the kind of innocent cruelty that only privileged children can demonstrate. "Yes," replied the girl honestly, not understanding that the question was a trap. "You," said a girl in a pink dress, moving away as if poverty were contagious. "Didn't you have a real house? Not even a bathroom?" "Sometimes I slept in cardboard boxes," said the little girl, trying to explain her past life without realizing how her words were being received by the group. The children laughed, not with deliberate malice, but with the kind of discomfort that turns into cruelty when you don't know how to process information so different from your reality. For them, the idea of someone sleeping in cardboard boxes was so absurd that it could only be funny. The girl felt her cheeks turn red, finally understanding that she had said something wrong. She looked towards the table where the women were talking, looking for support, but found only looks that confirmed her growing sense of not belonging. "My mom said that people like you sometimes steal things," continued the blonde boy, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of the adults. "I never stole anything," protested the girl, her voice getting small. "They all say that," replied one of the girls, with a disdain that she had clearly learned by observing her mother. At that moment, the stepmother approached the group, her expression a perfect mask of maternal concern. "What's going on here, children?" "She's telling stories about living on the street," said the blonde boy, as if he were reporting a crime. "Oh dear," said the stepmother to the girl, her voice filled with false compassion. "Maybe it's better not to talk about the past. It can make others feel uncomfortable." The humiliation was like a slap in the face to the child. She had learned to take pride in her survival, in her courage, in the strength she had demonstrated living alone on the streets. But now, those same experiences were presented as something shameful, something that should be hidden. The other children, realizing that they had implicit permission to continue their cruelty, began to ask more questions. If she knew how to read, if she knew bad people, if she had ever been truly hungry. Each question was a new humiliation, turning her story of survival into entertainment for spoiled children. The nanny, who had been instructed to observe and protect, tried to intervene, but the stepmother quickly diverted her with a fabricated task in the kitchen. "Could you check if the tea is ready, dear? We're almost running out." Alone and surrounded by a group that saw her as an exotic curiosity, the girl began to withdraw emotionally. Her answers became monosyllabic, her eyes fixed on the floor, and she began to shrink physically as she had learned to do on the streets when she felt threatened. It was then that a late family arrived, an elegant couple accompanied by a boy who seemed to be the same age as the protagonist. The boy had brown hair and gentle eyes, and when he saw the girl isolated and visibly uncomfortable, something in his expression changed. "Hi," he said, approaching her while his parents greeted the hosts. "I'm the son of the neighbors from the Blue House. What's your name?" She hesitated, not used to genuine kindness coming from children in that environment. "Do you want to play hide and seek?" he offered, completely ignoring the other children who watched them with disapproval. "I know all the best hiding places in this house." The girl looked at him, searching for signs of mockery or cruelty, but found only a genuine smile and eyes that seemed really interested in her friendship. For the first time in weeks, she felt something akin to hope. "I would like that," she said softly. The boy extended his hand to her, and when she took it, she felt an instant connection. Here was someone who didn't care about her past, who didn't see her as a curiosity or a threat, but simply as a child who deserved friendship. But as they ran together through the garden, laughing and playing for the first time in weeks, the stepmother watched them from afar with eyes that sparkled with a new idea. If she couldn't isolate the girl completely, maybe she could use this new friendship differently. After all, every innocent friendship can be corrupted with the right words whispered into the right ears. And the stepmother was just beginning to show how cruel she could be when she felt her position threatened. The afternoon tea ended with apparent success, but it had left seeds planted that would grow into much bigger problems. And for the first time since arriving at the mansion, the girl had found something that really scared her. The possibility of losing not only her new home, but also the only genuine friendship she had found in that world of wealth and falsehood. In the days that followed the afternoon tea, the friendship between the girl and the son of the neighbors blossomed like a rare flower in arid soil. The boy, who had introduced himself simply as the boy from the blue house, began to visit the mansion almost daily, always bringing with him a contagious energy and a natural ability to make the little girl forget, even if temporarily, about the tensions that permeated her new life. The businessman watched this friendship with a mixture of relief and concern. It was comforting to see the girl laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks, but something in the way his stepmother watched the two children playing made him uneasy. There was a calculating coldness in her eyes that he had learned to recognize, the same expression she wore when she was planning something. "It's so good she's finally made a friend," commented the stepmother during dinner, delicately slicing a piece of salmon. "Though I do worry if this friendship might not be problematic." "Problematic how?" asked the millionaire, immediately alert. "Well, darling, you know how impressionable children can be, and our little guest is still adjusting to the appropriate behavior standards for our social class." She made a dramatic pause. "It would be terrible if she ended up negatively influencing a child from such a respectable family." The implication was clear and venomous. The girl, with her past on the streets, was a bad influence who could corrupt a pure child from high society. The businessman felt the anger rise in his chest, but forced himself to maintain his composure. "She's a sweet and well-behaved child," he said firmly. "Any family would be happy to have a child with half the kindness she demonstrates." The stepmother smiled that icy smile that he had grown to hate. "Of course, darling. I just think we should monitor the situation closely." What the businessman didn't know was that the stepmother had already begun her campaign of sabotage. During her courtesy visits to the neighbors, social gatherings that were an essential part of maintaining her position in high society, she had begun to plant carefully selected seeds of doubt and concern. "It's admirable what you're doing," she had said to the boy's mother during an elegant luncheon at the most exclusive country club in town. "Taking in a child in need is truly noble. Though between you and me, I do worry about her adaptation." "Worry how?" asked the other woman, her curiosity piqued by the veiled gossip. "Well, you understand. Children who come from such different environments sometimes carry behaviors that can be challenging. Nothing that can't be corrected with time and patience, of course. But I worry about the influence she may have on other children who aren't used to that type of life experience." The words were chosen carefully to sound like genuine concern, while planting seeds of suspicion. The boy's mother, who until then had found charming the story of a brave child saving a man in danger, began to see the situation in a different light. "What kind of behaviors?" she asked, now visibly concerned. "Oh, nothing dramatic," replied the stepmother with a studied sigh. "Just little things. Trouble with the truth sometimes, a tendency to take things that aren't hers, you understand. Habits she developed to survive on the streets. We're working on it, of course, but it's a long process. These carefully constructed lies began to do their dirty work. The boy's mother began to watch her son's playdates with the girl more closely, looking for signs of the problematic behaviors that had been suggested. And when you look for trouble with enough determination, you can find it anywhere. When she saw the two children playing pirates in the garden, using sticks as swords, she interpreted it as violent behavior influenced by the girl's life on the streets. When she found her son sharing his expensive toys with the little girl, she worried that he was being manipulated by someone used to taking things from others. The first manifestation of this change in attitude happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The boy had arrived to play as usual, but this time his mother accompanied him to the door, something she had never done before. "Dear," she said to the stepmother, "I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to chat quickly about the children's playdates." The stepmother feigned surprise, but her eyes gleamed with barely disguised satisfaction. "Of course, what concerns you?" "Well, yesterday my son came home telling stories about adventures that you two invented. Stories about running away from bad people, about hiding in dark places. That kind of thing makes me a little uncomfortable." "Oh, I completely understand your concern," said the stepmother, her voice dripping with false compassion. "Unfortunately, our little guest sometimes confuses reality with fantasy. Traumatic experiences can do that to children. We're seeking professional help, of course." The lie was delivered with such conviction that the boy's mother felt a mixture of pity and growing alarm. "Maybe it's better if the visits were less frequent, just until she stabilizes better." "How wise of you," agreed the stepmother. "Protection of our children must always come first." That afternoon, when the boy tried to enter the mansion, as he always did, he found the door closed and the stepmother waiting for him with an expression of false sadness. "Oh dear," she said, "I'm afraid our little guest isn't feeling very well today. Maybe it's best if you go home and play with her another day." The boy, confused but polite, nodded and walked away. But when he looked back, he saw the girl at the second-floor window, watching him leave with an expression of confusion and sadness that made him stop. She had run downstairs when she heard his voice at the door, excited to show him a drawing she had made during the morning, a drawing of the two of them as superheroes saving people in danger. But when she arrived at the entrance hall, she found only the stepmother closing the door. "Where did he go?" she asked, her voice small and confused. "Oh dear, he said he couldn't play today. Maybe he was busy with other things." The stepmother paused, observing the impact of her words on the child's face. "You know, sometimes people get tired of playing with the same person every day." The casual cruelty of the observation hit the girl like a physical blow. On the streets, she had learned that friendships were rare and precious, but also fragile and temporary. The idea that her first real friendship in that new world was already coming to an end brought back all the fears of abandonment she carried. "Did he say that?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Well, not exactly with those words," replied the stepmother with false delicacy, "but sometimes people are too polite to say what they really feel." During the rest of the week, the pattern repeated itself. The boy would show up to play, but there was always some reason why the girl couldn't receive him. She was doing homework, she was grounded for some invented transgression, she was spending time with tutors. Each time, the stepmother offered different explanations to the boy, all designed to make it seem like the girl was drifting away from him by her own choice. For the little girl, each day without her friend was a growing confirmation that she had been abandoned once again. She began to isolate herself, spending hours in her room, drawing solitary figures in empty landscapes. Her newfound joy began to wither like a plant without water. The businessman noticed the change, but when he asked about the boy, the The stepmother always had a plausible explanation. "Children are like that, darling," she would say with a sigh. "Intense friendships that burn out quickly. It's better for her to learn early on that relationships can be temporary." But there was something darker developing beyond the simple sabotage of a childhood friendship. The stepmother had realized that her direct methods weren't working as expected. The businessman was too attentive, too protective, too determined to keep the girl at home. It was time to change tactics once again. If she couldn't remove the child through problematic behavior or social isolation, perhaps it was time to question something more fundamental: the businessman's own ability to be a suitable parent for a child with special needs. After all, a single man, obsessed with work, with a net worth built on high-risk investments in the stock market and even in volatile cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, what kind of emotional stability could he offer a traumatized child? It was a line of attack that would require careful preparation, but the stepmother was willing to be patient. After all, there was a lot at stake: a considerable inheritance, an established social position, and a life of luxury that she was not willing to share with a 4-year-old intruder who had appeared out of nowhere. The chess game was being played, and she was confident that, eventually, she would be able to checkmate both the girl and the man who insisted on protecting her. Autumn arrived in the great metropolis, bringing with it a coldness that seemed to infiltrate even the luxurious mansion. Golden leaves fell slowly in the perfectly manicured garden, creating a natural carpet that contrasted with the increasingly tense atmosphere that dominated the house. The girl, now 3 months living in that world of wealth and silent conflicts, had become a shadow of herself. The businessman watched with growing concern the changes in his little protégé. The vivacious child who had saved his life was transforming into a melancholy figure who spent hours looking out the window, as if waiting for something that never arrived. Her drawings, once full of vibrant colors and happy figures, now showed somber landscapes and solitary characters. "She's clearly depressed," said the stepmother during breakfast, her voice laden with false concern as she watched the girl push the food around her plate without eating. "Perhaps we need to consider more intensive professional help." The millionaire studied his stepmother's face, looking for the subtle signs of manipulation that he had learned to identify. There was something in her tone, a calculated urgency that made him uncomfortable. "What kind of help are you suggesting?" "Well, darling, there are specialized institutions that deal specifically with children who have suffered severe trauma. Places where she could receive 24-hour care, intensive therapy, socialization with other children in similar situations." The stepmother made a strategic pause. Places where she could really heal. The word institution sounded like an alarm in the businessman's mind. He had grown up hearing stories about orphanages and treatment centers, places that claimed to help children but often only processed them as numbers in a cold, bureaucratic system. "No," he said firmly. "She's staying here. This is her home." For the first time, the stepmother's mask of maternal concern slipped slightly, revealing a flash of frustration. "Darling, you need to be realistic. You're a single man with a company to run, investments to manage. Your funds and stock market investments require constant attention, and with the current volatility of the cryptocurrency market," she gestured vaguely towards the financial documents scattered on the table, "do you really have the time and emotional energy to deal with a child who clearly has complex psychological needs?" It was a skillfully constructed argument, attacking exactly the insecurities that the businessman felt but was reluctant to admit. It was true that his company was going through a turbulent period, with aggressive competitors trying to take market share and investors questioning some of his strategic decisions. There were nights when he came home exhausted, with his mind still spinning around spreadsheets and financial projections. "She needs stability," he insisted, but there was a hesitation in his voice that did not go unnoticed. "And that's exactly what I'm suggesting," replied the stepmother quickly, detecting the opening. "Professional stability, specialized care, a structured environment where she can process her traumas properly." At that moment, the girl raised her eyes from the plate and looked directly at the businessman. There was something in her expression, not fear, but a quiet resignation that disturbed him more than any tear could have done. It was as if she were preparing for yet another loss, yet another abandonment in a life that had known many. "Can I leave the table?" she asked politely, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. "Of course, dear," he replied, watching as she walked away slowly, her small footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. After she left, the stepmother leaned forward, lowering her voice as if she were sharing an intimate secret. "Darling, I know you feel responsible for her. It's admirable, really. But sometimes true love means making difficult choices for the sake of the loved one." The businessman didn't answer immediately, his mind struggling between the stepmother's logical arguments and a protective instinct that screamed against any idea of separation. He had built a financial empire based on rational decisions, careful risk analysis, and strategic planning. But when it came to the girl, all those skills seemed inadequate. That afternoon, while working in his home office, he heard a sound that he hadn't heard in weeks, the girl's laughter. Curious, he approached the window and saw something that made his heart clench. There in the garden, hidden behind the ornamental fountain, the boy from the blue house was playing with the little girl. The two children had clearly found a way to circumvent the barriers that the adults had placed between them. They laughed as they played hide-and-seek among the trees, completely absorbed in their mutual joy. It was the first time in weeks that the businessman had seen his protégé truly happy. But his joy was interrupted when he saw the stepmother approach the children with determined steps. He couldn't hear her words through the glass, but he could see the body language, the way she gestured, how the children gradually separated, how the boy began to walk away with a confused expression. Running down the stairs quickly, the businessman arrived at the garden in time to hear the end of the conversation. "And that's why I think it's better if you don't play together anymore for now," the stepmother was saying, her voice sweet but inflexible. "Just until she feels better." "But she seems fine when we play together," protested the boy, with the brutal honesty of children. "Sometimes appearances are deceiving, dear. Adults know what's best." She turned and saw the businessman approaching. "Oh, hello, darling. I was just explaining to our young visitor that our little guest needs some time to focus on her recovery." The businessman looked at the girl, who had shrunk back into that defensive posture that he recognized from the streets. Her big eyes were fixed on the floor, as if she were preparing for yet another disappointment. "Actually," he said, surprising everyone, including himself, "I think playing with friends is exactly what she needs." The stepmother's mask slipped completely for a moment, revealing an expression of cold anger before recomposing herself. "Darling, we've already discussed this. The situation is delicate. The situation is that she's a 4-year-old child who needs friends," he interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "And any treatment or therapy she needs can be done while she maintains a normal life here at home." That night, after the children went back to playing and the boy went home promising to return the next day, the tension in the mansion had become almost palpable. The stepmother circled the house like a caged feline, her high heels clicking on the marble with unnecessary force. The businessman found the girl in her room, leafing through a book of fairy tales that had become her favorite. She looked up when he entered, and for the first time in weeks there was a glimmer of something akin to hope there. "Are you really going to let him keep coming to play with me?" she asked, her voice filled with a vulnerability that made his heart clench. "Of course I am. Why wouldn't I?" The lady said I was making people uncomfortable, that maybe it was better if I stayed alone until I got more normal. The fury that took over the businessman was so intense that he had to struggle to keep his voice calm. You're already normal. You're perfect exactly as you are. But I lived on the street. I don't know how to be a rich girl. You don't need to be a rich girl. You just need to be yourself. He sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. There are people in this house who may try to make you feel like you don't belong here, but they're wrong. This is your home, and you have as much right to be here as anyone else. The girl studied him with those big, wise eyes that always surprised him. Do you promise you won't send me away? I promise. But even as he made the promise, a part of his mind was working on the problems he knew were coming. The stepmother had shown her cards too clearly that afternoon. She was no longer trying to be subtle in her attacks, which meant she was getting desperate, and desperate people, as he had learned in the business world, were the most dangerous of all. They were willing to take risks that rational people would never consider, to cross lines that should remain untouched. That night, while checking financial reports in his office, the businessman made a decision that would change the course of events. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. "I need to hire a private investigator," he said, when the call was answered. "I want complete information on someone, and I want it to be discreet." It was time to find out exactly who he was dealing with. His net worth in stocks and diverse investments had taught him the importance of knowing all the players in any high-stakes game, and the game for the girl's safety had definitely become high stakes. The following weeks brought a deceptive calm to the mansion, like the quiet that precedes a devastating storm. The businessman had resumed his work routine, but now with constant vigilance over the interactions between his stepmother and the girl. Each conversation was analyzed, each gesture observed, each tone of voice deciphered for signs of manipulation. The little girl, in turn, had recovered part of her natural joy thanks to the renewed friendship with the boy from the Blue House. The two children spent afternoons exploring the gardens, inventing elaborate games, and creating a world of their own where the complexities of adults couldn't penetrate. It was comforting to see the girl laughing again, but the businessman couldn't shake the feeling that he was just watching the eye of the hurricane. It was on a rainy Thursday that the private investigation he had commissioned finally produced results. The detective, a discreet and efficient man who had worked for several large companies verifying the backgrounds of executives, arrived at the office with a thick folder of documents that would change everything. "What did you find out about her?" asked the businessman, pouring coffee while the rain drummed against the windows of the corporate office. "More than I expected," replied the investigator, opening the folder with a grave expression. "Your stepmother has an interesting past." "Very interesting." The documents revealed a story that the businessman had never suspected. The woman who had married his father wasn't exactly who she claimed to be. Her real name was different. Her family history had been carefully fabricated, and more importantly, she had a history of relationships with older, wealthy men that ended conveniently for her. 3 previous husbands, explained the detective, pointing to photographs and certificates. All men of considerable means, all deceased or missing under circumstances that, while not criminally suspicious, were very convenient for her financially. "What do you mean?" "The first husband suffered a fatal car accident just 2 years after the marriage, leaving her as the sole beneficiary of a substantial life insurance policy. The second developed a rapidly progressive degenerative disease and spent his last months completely dependent on her, during which time he transferred most of his assets to her name. The third simply disappeared during a business trip, declared legally absent after 5 years. The businessman felt a chill run down his spine. "And my father?" "Your father fits the pattern perfectly. Older man, widower, wealthy, with no close family except you, who was frequently traveling on business at the time of the wedding. She had complete access to his resources during the last 2 years of his life." The reality of the situation began to crystallize in the businessman's mind. He had always found strange the speed with which his father's health had deteriorated after the marriage, but the doctors had attributed it to the natural progression of age and the stress of business. Now, a much more sinister possibility presented itself. "There's more," continued the investigator. "She has connections with a lawyer specializing in inheritance disputes, a man with a questionable reputation who has a history of helping widows contest wills and claim inheritances larger than originally designated." "You think she—" "I think she's a professional predator," said the detective bluntly. "And your new ward represents a direct threat to her plans for your estate." The businessman spent the rest of the afternoon poring over documents, each page revealing new details about the woman who had lived in his house for years, without him suspecting her true nature. There were photographs of her with other men, financial records showing suspicious transfers, and more worryingly, evidence that she had been investigating ways to challenge the legality of the girl's temporary adoption. When he arrived home that night, he found the mansion silent. The girl was in her room doing homework, and the stepmother was in her private den talking on the phone. He quietly approached the ajar door and overheard fragments of a conversation that confirmed his worst fears. "No, I can't do anything obvious now. He's too watchful." Pause. "Yes, I know how much is at stake. Billions in net worth, investments in international stocks, hedge funds, not to mention the cryptocurrency holdings." Another pause. "The kid complicates everything. If she's officially adopted, it completely changes the line of succession." The businessman felt the blood run cold in his veins at the calculating coldness in her voice. "I need more time to find something that disqualifies him as a suitable guardian. Mental instability, neglect, anything that demonstrates he's unfit to care for a traumatized child." She chuckled softly, a sound devoid of humor. "Single men obsessed with work aren't exactly ideal for kids with special needs, are they?" At that moment, the businessman understood he wasn't just dealing with jealousy or resentment. He was facing a woman who saw the girl as a direct obstacle to a multi-million-dollar inheritance, someone who had built a whole career eliminating similar obstacles. He quietly went up to the girl's room and found her sitting on the bed, drawing in her favorite notebook. When she looked up and smiled at him, the businessman felt an iron determination form in his chest. No matter what it cost, he wouldn't allow anything to happen to this child who had saved his life and, in the process, had given new meaning to his existence. "How was your day, sweetie?" he asked, sitting beside her. "It was good. The boy from the blue house taught me a new game with stones from the garden." She showed him the drawing, 2 figures playing under a tree with a bright sun in the sky. "I drew us playing." "It's beautiful," he said, but his mind was racing through options and strategies. "You know I love you very much, don't you?" She nodded solemnly. "I love you too. You're like a dad to me." The simple words struck the businessman like lightning. For months, he had struggled with doubts about his ability to be a good father, questioning whether a single man focused on business could truly raise a traumatized child. But in that moment, looking into those trusting eyes, he realized he was already a father in every way that mattered. "Would you like me to be your dad officially?" he asked. The girl's eyes widened. "Can you do that?" "I can. There are papers I need to sign, legal processes I need to complete, but yes, I can make you officially my daughter." The joy that exploded on the child's face was like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. She threw herself into his arms, hugging him with all the strength of her small body. "I would like that very much," she whispered against his chest. "Very, very much." That night, after the girl fell asleep, the businessman spent hours in his office making calls and sending emails. He contacted lawyers specializing in family law, expedited the adoption processes he had started months ago, and began preparing a legal defense against any attempt to question his suitability as a father. More importantly, he began to take precautions. He hired discreet security for the property, installed surveillance cameras in strategic locations around the house, and established protocols to ensure the girl was never left alone with the stepmother. But what he didn't know was that his stepmother had also accelerated her own plans. The conversation he had overheard wasn't just planning, it was coordination with allies he didn't even know existed, and her next move would be far more drastic than anything she had tried before. The next morning, when he came down for breakfast, he found the stepmother already dressed to leave, carrying an elegant travel bag. "I'm going to spend a few days at the beach house," she announced, her smile brighter and more fake than ever. "I need some time for reflection, you understand. All this tension has been very draining." The businessman nodded, relieved at the prospect of a few days of peace. "Have a good trip. Take good care of yourselves," she said, kissing him on the cheek with cold lips. Then she bent down to the girl. "And you, sweetheart, be a good girl for your guardian." After she left, the atmosphere of the house changed immediately. It was as if a toxic cloud had been removed, allowing sunlight to finally penetrate every corner. The girl played more freely, laughed louder, and for the first time in months, the mansion actually felt like a home. But the peace would be temporary, because the stepmother hadn't gone to the beach house to reflect. She had gone to implement the final phase of a plan that would make it impossible for the businessman to keep the girl, even if he discovered the truth about who she really was. After all, it was much easier to destroy a man when he was happy and unsuspecting than when he was alert and suspicious. The 3 days without the stepmother's presence in the mansion were like a breath of fresh air after months of silent suffocation. The girl flourished in ways that the businessman hadn't seen since the first days after the hospital. She ran through the marble hallways with genuine joy, hummed during meals, and her drawings returned to showing vibrant colors and smiling figures. The businessman took advantage of this period to accelerate the official adoption processes. He met with lawyers, completed a mountain of paperwork, and submitted to psychological and financial evaluations required by the legal system. Each signed document brought him closer to making the girl officially his daughter, and each step left him more determined to protect her from any threat. It was during the afternoon of the 3rd day that the first sign of trouble appeared. The businessman was in an important video conference with international investors, discussing a complex merger that could significantly expand his stock portfolio, when his secretary interrupted him with a worried expression. "Sir, there are people here who say they are from social services. They insist on speaking with you about the girl." The businessman's blood ran cold. He quickly ended the meeting and went downstairs to find 2 middle-aged women waiting in the living room, both carrying official folders and professionally neutral expressions that couldn't hide a cold determination. "Sir," said the taller of the two, presenting credentials, "we are from the Child Welfare Department. We received an anonymous complaint about possible neglect and an unsuitable environment for a minor in your care." "Neglect?" repeated the businessman, his mind racing through the possibilities. What kind of complaint? Allegations that the child is being exposed to dangerous situations, that her emotional stability is compromised due to an unstable home environment, and that there are concerns about your fitness as a single guardian for a child with severe trauma. Each word was like a carefully placed dagger. The businessman immediately recognized the arguments that his stepmother had used in her attempts to convince him to send the girl to an institution. Now those same arguments were being used by official authorities. "Can I see these specific allegations?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The second woman opened her folder and began to read a list that sounded as if it had been dictated directly by the stepmother. Child frequently seen crying, social isolation from children of her own age, regressive behavior, constant nightmares, and signs of severe emotional instability. There are also concerns, added the first woman, about your ability to provide adequate supervision, considering your extensive professional responsibilities. We understand that you have a financial empire that requires constant attention, investments in volatile markets, including cryptocurrencies, and frequent business trips. The businessman realized that whoever had made the complaint knew intimate details of both his personal and professional life. There was no doubt that the stepmother was behind it, but he also knew she wasn't acting alone. The information was too specific, too organized to be one person's work. "Where is the child now?" asked the first woman. "In the garden, playing with a friend, supervised by the nanny. We would like to speak with her." "Certainly. But first, I want to contact my lawyer." The women exchanged a look. "Sir, this is just a preliminary investigation. There's no need for legal dramatics unless you're hiding something." The implication was clear and insulting. The businessman forced himself to remain composed. "I'm not hiding anything. I'm just exercising my right to have legal representation present during any official investigation involving my daughter." While they waited for the lawyer to arrive, the businessman watched the two women through the window, talking to the girl in the garden. She answered their questions with her characteristic honesty, but he could see her posture becoming more tense with each passing minute. The boy from the blue house had been sent away, and the little girl was now alone with strangers asking questions about her life and feelings. When the lawyer arrived, an experienced man who had helped the businessman navigate several complex corporate disputes, the situation became more formal and much more serious. "My client has fully cooperated with your investigation," said the lawyer, after reviewing the documents presented. "But these allegations are vague and appear to be based on unverified third-party information." "We have a duty to investigate all complaints," replied the first social worker, "and our conversation with the child raises some concerns." "What concerns?" "She demonstrates signs of extreme separation anxiety, fear of abandonment, and excessive emotional dependence on her guardian. She also admitted to having frequent nightmares and periods of deep sadness." The businessman felt a rising fury. Of course, the girl had separation anxiety. She had been abandoned on the streets at 4 years old. Of course she was afraid of abandonment. She had been rejected by every adult in her life before him. These were not signs of neglect. They were signs of a child who was gradually healing from deep trauma. "These are normal responses for a child who has survived abandonment and the streets," explained the lawyer. "My client has been providing appropriate therapy and a stable environment for her recovery." "Perhaps," said the second social worker, "but our concern is whether a single man with such extensive professional responsibilities can truly provide the emotional stability that a traumatized child needs." "He has more than adequate financial resources," argued the lawyer. "Financial resources are not enough. A child needs consistent emotional presence, something that can be difficult for someone managing a business empire." The discussion continued for another hour, with the social workers presenting a barrage of concerns that seemed to have been rehearsed. They questioned everything from the absence of a stable mother figure in the house to the suitability of a high society environment for a child from humble origins. Finally, they got to the central point of their visit. "Given these concerns," said the first woman, "we recommend that the child be temporarily placed in a specialized foster home while a more complete evaluation is conducted." "Absolutely not," said the businessman, his voice laced with an authority he had developed running a multi-million-dollar company. "She's not going anywhere. Sir, I understand this is emotional for you, but you need to consider what is best for the child. What's best for her is to stay in the only stable home she's ever known, with the only person who has shown unconditional love for her." At that moment, as if she had overheard the conversation, the girl appeared at the door of the room. Her big eyes were wide with fear, and she ran directly to the businessman, clinging to his leg as if it were an anchor in a storm. "Are you going to send me away?" she asked, her voice small but filled with terror. The businessman knelt down and picked her up, looking directly into her eyes. "Never. You are my daughter, and no one is going to take you from here. But the ladies said maybe I have to go to a place where other people can take better care of me." The rage that took over the businessman was so intense that he had to try not to explode right there. "They're wrong. You stay here with me forever." The social workers watched the interaction with studiously neutral expressions, but he could see that they were cataloguing every word, every gesture, looking for evidence to use against him. "We'll conclude our initial investigation here," said the first woman finally, "but we'll be back next week for a more complete assessment. Until then, we strongly recommend that you consider alternative arrangements that may be more beneficial for the child's well-being." After they left, the businessman spent the rest of the afternoon consoling the girl, who was visibly shaken by the prospect of being removed from the only home she considered safe. She clung to him with a desperation that broke his heart, whispering promises to be a better girl if he let her stay. "You don't need to be different," he said, stroking her hair. "You're perfect exactly as you are." That night, after the girl finally fell exhausted into her bed, the businessman called the private investigator. "I need you to tell me everything about who made this complaint," he said, "and I need to know now." "I'm already investigating," replied the detective. "The social workers were approached by someone with very specific information about your situation. Someone who knows intimate details about your financial and personal life. My stepmother, probably, but she's not acting alone. There's a lawyer involved, the same one I mentioned before. And there's evidence that they are preparing a broader case, questioning not only your fitness as a guardian, but also your mental competence to manage your own estate." The businessman felt as if the floor was collapsing under his feet. "What do you mean? If they can prove that you're mentally unstable, obsessed with a child to the point of neglecting financial responsibilities, making irrational decisions based on guilt and trauma, they can challenge your ability to manage your own business and fortune." The magnitude of the conspiracy began to unfold. It wasn't just about removing the girl from the line of succession. It was about removing him too, leaving all his fortune in the hands of a woman who had made a career out of becoming a wealthy widow. But the businessman had built an empire not only through wealth, but through strategy, determination, and the ability to fight against formidable adversaries. And now, the fight of his life was just beginning. Because no matter how many billions were at stake, no matter how powerful his adversaries were, he wouldn't allow anyone to touch the child who had saved his life and given new meaning to his existence. The week following the visit from social services was a period of unbearable tension. The businessman had completely transformed his routine, cancelling important business trips and delegating crucial responsibilities to focus entirely on protecting the girl. His stock and cryptocurrency investments continued to fluctuate in international markets, but for the first time in his career, the profits and losses seemed secondary compared to the safety of his little protégé. The girl, in turn, had become a haunted shadow of herself again. The joy that she had regained during the stepmother's absence evaporated like dew under the scorching sun. She clung to the businessman constantly, following him through the mansion like a small ghost, terrified that at any moment strangers would appear to take her away. "You promise you won't let them take me?" she asked several times a day, her big eyes full of an anxiety that no 4-year-old should know. "I promise," he always replied, but internally he knew that promises alone wouldn't be enough against the bureaucratic machine that had been set in motion against them. It was on a Friday morning that the stepmother returned from her reflection at the beach house. She arrived radiant, with a golden tan and a smile that couldn't completely hide the malicious satisfaction in her eyes. She wore a designer outfit that cost more than many families earned in a year and carried expensive gifts that she had clearly bought to keep up appearances. "Darlings," she exclaimed, kissing the air near the businessman's cheeks. "How I missed you. How was everything here? The businessman studied her carefully, looking for signs that she knew about the visit from social services. He found nothing but a curiosity that seemed too genuine to be real. "It was quiet," he said, deciding not to reveal his cards yet. "And our little princess?" she asked, crouching down to get to the girl's height, who had hidden behind the businessman's legs the moment she saw her enter. "Did you miss me?" The child only squeezed the businessman's leg harder, her instincts alerting her to the danger even without fully understanding its source. "She's a little shy today," explained the businessman. "She's had a rough week." "Oh, what happened?" The question was asked in a tone of concern, but there was something in the stepmother's eyes, a glimmer of anticipation, that confirmed the businessman's suspicions. She knew exactly what had happened. "Nothing important," he replied. "Just normal adjustments." During lunch, the stepmother told elaborate stories about her week at the beach, describing relaxation and spiritual renewal in details that sounded rehearsed. But the businessman noticed how her eyes constantly darted to the girl, observing every reaction, cataloguing every sign of discomfort. "You know," she said casually as she cut a gourmet salad, "I met the most interesting neighbors at the beach. A couple of therapists specializing in child trauma. They run a wonderful institution for children who have suffered abandonment and abuse." The girl stopped eating, her little spoon suspended in the air. "How interesting," said the businessman, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, they told me the most fascinating things about how traumatized children benefit from structured environments with 24-hour professional care. Apparently, even the most genuine love is sometimes not enough when the trauma is too deep," she sighed theatrically. "It's depressing to think that sometimes our best intentions can inadvertently harm those we try to help." The businessman saw the girl pale, her little hands starting to tremble. It was deliberate psychological torture, disguised as casual conversation. "I think the girl has heard enough about therapy for one day," he said firmly, rising from the table. "Oh, of course, dear. How insensitive of me." The stepmother smiled at the child with false tenderness. "We didn't want to worry you, little one. It was just adult talk." But the damage was done. The girl spent the rest of the day in silence, her drawings showing small figures surrounded by high walls and shadowy faces watching from afar. That afternoon, while the girl was playing quietly in her room, the private investigator called with news that confirmed the businessman's worst fears. "The complaint was orchestrated by a lawyer named Marcus Villela," reported the detective. "He has a history of helping widows contest wills and challenge the mental competence of heirs. Your stepmother has been a client of his for months." "What kind of case are they building?" "It's sophisticated. They're arguing that your obsession with the child is evidence of mental instability caused by traumatic guilt from the accident, that you are making irrational decisions, such as focusing more on the child than on business, that demonstrate a deterioration in judgment." The businessman felt a cold rage spreading through his chest. "And the social workers? They believe they are doing the right thing. They have been fed carefully selected information that paints a picture of a wealthy but emotionally unstable man trying to use a traumatized child to heal his own psychological traumas. That's ridiculous. It may be, but it's convincing when presented by experienced professionals. They have experts ready to testify about the dangers of placing children traumatized in high-pressure environments with single guardians who lack adequate psychological training. The businessman understood that he was facing something far more dangerous than he had initially realized. It wasn't just an attempt to remove the girl, it was a coordinated attack aimed at destroying his credibility as a competent person. "There's more," continued the investigator. "They are preparing a petition for a conservator to be appointed to manage your financial affairs, claiming that your recent decisions demonstrate an inability to properly manage an estate worth billions." Who would this conservator be? Probably someone appointed by Marcus Villela, someone who, conveniently, would be influenced by your stepmother. The magnitude of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. They weren't just trying to take the girl from him. They were trying to take everything, leaving him without the resources to fight, and his stepmother in control of a fortune built through generations. That night, after the girl finally fell asleep after hours of nightmares, the businessman found himself in the room where it had all begun, looking out the window at the street where she had first appeared in his life. The memory of her breaking the glass of his burning car, risking her own life to save a stranger, strengthened his resolve. On Monday, the social workers returned as promised, this time accompanied by a child psychologist and a senior supervisor. The girl clung to the businessman when they entered, her small body trembling with anticipated fear. "We would like to conduct a more thorough evaluation," announced the supervisor. "This will include separate interviews with the child, a complete inspection of the premises, and a review of your financial and professional situation." "Why is the financial situation relevant?" asked the businessman's lawyer. "Because there are concerns that the stress of managing a business empire while caring for a traumatized child is affecting the quality of care she receives." During the following hours, the mansion was transformed into a silent battlefield. The girl was taken to a separate room for an interview with the psychologist, while the others examined every aspect of the businessman's life. They questioned his work hours, his business trips, his recent investment decisions. "We see here that you have cancelled several important meetings in recent weeks," noted one of the social workers. "This suggests that your parental responsibilities are interfering with your professional obligations." "It suggests that I am prioritizing my daughter above meetings," corrected the businessman. "But for a man in your position, neglecting professional responsibilities can have serious financial consequences. Is this sustainable in the long term?" Each question was a carefully constructed trap. If he said that work was a priority, it would seem that he was neglecting the child. If he said that the child was a priority, he would appear financially irresponsible. When the evaluation finally ended, the psychologist came out of the room with the girl looking even more haunted than when they went in. She ran immediately to the businessman, burying her face in his chest. "They asked me a lot of questions," she whispered. "Questions about whether I feel safe, whether I have nightmares, whether you get mad at me." "And what did you say?" "The truth. That you love me, and that I feel safe with you. But they kept asking if I wouldn't feel safer with other people who know how to take care of sad kids." The businessman closed his eyes, feeling the net closing around him. But when he looked down and saw those trusting eyes looking up at him, he knew that he would fight to the end. Because some battles are worth any price, and protecting the child who had saved his life was one of them. The official notification arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a court officer with the solemnity reserved for moments that change lives forever. The businessman opened the sealed envelope with hands that trembled slightly, already suspecting the contents he would find inside. "Emergency custody hearing," he read aloud, the words echoing through the room like a sentence. In 3 days, he would have to appear before a judge to defend his right to keep the girl who had become the center of his existence. The little girl was in the garden playing with the boy from the blue house, their innocent laughter floating through the sunny morning, completely oblivious to the legal storm that was approaching. The businessman watched her through the window, his heart contracting at the thought that those moments of pure joy might be numbered. "What does the document say exactly?" asked the lawyer, who had arrived in less than an hour after the urgent call. "They are alleging imminent risk to the child's well-being due to emotional instability and neglect by the temporary guardian. They are requesting immediate removal to a specialized care environment." The businessman ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that had become frequent in recent weeks. "How did they get to this so quickly?" Someone with a lot of influence is expediting this process, replied the lawyer grimly. Normally, cases like this take months to reach the courts. Having an emergency hearing in 3 days means that they have convinced a judge that there is immediate danger. At that moment, the stepmother elegantly descended the stairs, wearing an outfit that probably cost more than many people earned in a year. There was something different about her posture, a confidence that bordered on arrogance, as if she already knew the outcome of a game that the others were still trying to understand. "Good morning, dear," she said, kissing the air near his face. "You look tense. Business problems?" The businessman studied her carefully. "Something like that." "Well, I'm sure everything will work out for the best," she said, pouring herself coffee with studiedly casual movements. "Sometimes the universe has a way of showing us what is really best for everyone involved." There was something in the tone of her voice, a poorly disguised satisfaction, that confirmed the businessman's suspicions. She not only knew about the hearing, she had orchestrated every move that led to this moment. "Where were you yesterday afternoon?" he asked casually. "Shopping downtown, why?" She paused, the coffee cup suspended between the table and her lips. "Are you interrogating me, dear?" "Just curious." But the businessman had already instructed the private investigator to check her movements, and he knew that she had spent 2 hours in Marcus Villela's office the previous afternoon, exactly when the emergency petition had been filed. During the rest of the day, he dedicated himself intensively to preparing for the hearing. He gathered financial documents proving his stability, medical reports on the girl's progress, evaluations from the nanny and teachers, and letters of recommendation from respected figures in the business community. "We need to prepare for the worst-case scenario," warned the lawyer during a meeting that stretched into the afternoon. "If the judge determines that there is an immediate risk, they can remove the child from your custody immediately, even before the end of the hearing." "That can't happen," said the businessman, his voice filled with an iron determination. "She has already been abandoned once. I will not allow her to be traumatized again." "Then we need an offensive strategy. We can't just defend. We need to attack the credibility of those who are making these allegations." It was then that the private investigator brought the information that would completely change the course of the battle. He arrived at the office with a grave expression and a folder even thicker than the previous one. "I discovered something about Marcus Villela that will interest you," he said, spreading documents across the table. "He is not just a lawyer specializing in inheritance disputes. He has connections to a network of private foster homes that receive substantial payments from the government for each child placed in their care." The businessman raised his eyes. "Are you saying that there is a financial incentive to remove children from suitable homes?" "I'm saying that there is a systemic operation where lawyers like Villela identify vulnerable families, fabricate cases of neglect, and direct children to institutions that pay commissions for each placement. And my stepmother, she is not just a client of his. She is a silent partner in 3 of these institutions through a complex network of offshore companies." The revelation hit the businessman like lightning. It wasn't just about inheritance or jealousy, it was about profit. The girl had become a commodity in a corrupt scheme that turned vulnerable children into sources of revenue. "There's more," continued the investigator. "The institution where they plan to place the girl has a terrible record. Several complaints of neglect, children who have disappeared from the system, and at least 3 cases of abuse that have been hushed up through bribery and intimidation." The businessman's blood ran cold at the thought of his little protégé in that place. The child who had risked her life to save him would be handed over to predators who saw her only as numbers on a profit spreadsheet. "Do we have enough evidence to expose this?" asked the lawyer. "We have enough evidence to destroy their entire operation," replied the investigator, "but we need to be careful about how we use this information. They have powerful connections, and if they realize that we have discovered too much too soon, they may try to accelerate the process even further." That night, the businessman found the girl sitting on her bed, looking out the window at the garden where she had played so many times with her only true friend. There was a melancholy in her posture that broke his heart. "What are you thinking about, sweetie?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I'm thinking about whether I'll miss the little birds when I leave," she said simply. The answer hit him like a punch to the stomach. "Who said you're leaving?" "No one said, but I know." She turned to look at him, her big eyes full of a sad wisdom that no child should possess. "When you live on the streets, you learn to sense when things are going to change, and I feel that something is changing." The businessman picked her up, hugging her tightly. "I promised you that you would never be abandoned again, and I intend to keep that promise. But what if it doesn't depend on you?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "What if other people decide that I need to go somewhere else?" The question showed an understanding of the situation that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Even at 4 years old, she had learned that the power of adults over her life could be absolute and arbitrary. "Then I will fight those people with everything I have," he promised. "Do you remember when you saved me from the burning car?" She nodded. "You didn't think twice before breaking that glass and getting me out of there, even knowing that you could get hurt. Now it's my turn to save you." On the morning of the hearing, the mansion dawned shrouded in a tension that felt almost physical. The businessman had spent the night awake, reviewing strategies and mentally preparing for the battle of his life. His stock and Bitcoin investments continued to fluctuate in the global markets, but for the first time in his career, the millions at stake seemed irrelevant compared to what was really at risk. The girl, wearing her best dress, a light blue that highlighted her eyes, ate breakfast in silence. She had asked to accompany him to court, but the lawyer had advised against it, arguing that her presence could be used for emotional manipulation by both sides. "I want you to stay here with the nanny," said the businessman, kneeling down to get to her height. "And I want you to remember, no matter what happens today, you will always be my daughter in my heart." "And you will always be my dad," she replied, hugging him tightly. As he headed to the door, he found the stepmother waiting in the living room, dressed as if she were going to an elegant social event. Her eyes sparkled with a barely contained anticipation. "Good luck today, dear," she said, her smile cold as ice. "I'm sure everything will end exactly as it should." It was a threat disguised as support, and they both knew it. As the car drove away from the mansion, the businessman looked back and saw the girl at the window, waving with a small hand that seemed to be saying goodbye to much more than just a day. He didn't know that, as he headed to what could be the most important battle of his life, even more sinister forces were already moving to ensure that, regardless of the outcome of the hearing, the girl would never return home. The courtroom was silent as a mausoleum when the businessman entered, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble of the main hall. The imposing architecture of the building, with its tall columns and golden crests, would normally impress him, but that day he barely noticed the grandeur around him. His mind was completely focused on the battle he was about to wage for the life of the girl who had become his daughter in every way that mattered. The hearing room was smaller than he had imagined, but the atmosphere was charged with an intimidating formality. The judge, a grey-haired man with a stern expression, occupied his elevated place behind a dark wooden desk. The seats for the public were almost empty, except for a few figures that the businessman recognized as part of the legal machine that had been set up against him. Marcus Villela was present, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than many people earned in months. Next to him, 2 women that the businessman didn't recognize, but who clearly were experts, brought in to testify against his ability to care for the girl. And at the back of the room, watching everything with poorly disguised satisfaction, was his stepmother. This court is in session to hear the emergency petition for removal of custody, announced the judge, his voice echoing through the room. The case involves a minor of 4 years currently under the temporary care of the respondent. The businessman felt his stomach clench. Even after months of caring for the girl, loving her as his own daughter, he was still legally just a temporary guardian, a designation that now seemed fragile as glass. Marcus Villela rose to present the case against the businessman, and his performance was masterfully orchestrated. He painted a picture of a wealthy but emotionally unstable man, obsessed with a child to the point of neglecting crucial responsibilities. "Your Honor," said Villela, gesturing dramatically, "the respondent, despite his good intentions, possesses neither the training nor the emotional stability necessary to properly care for a severely traumatized child. His recent decisions, cancelling important meetings, neglecting millions of dollars in investments, isolating himself socially, demonstrate a pattern of behavior that suggests impaired judgment." The first witness was a child trauma psychologist who had never even met the girl, but who spoke with absolute authority about the dangers of placing traumatized children in unstructured environments with single guardians. "Children who have suffered severe abandonment like this minor," she explained, consulting notes that seemed to have been prepared specifically for this hearing, frequently develop problematic attachments with male authority figures. This can manifest as extreme emotional dependence that actually impedes the real healing process. "And what would be the ideal environment for such a child?" asked Villela. "A specialized residential care environment where trained professionals can provide intensive and structured therapy while gradually preparing the child for eventual placement in a suitably trained and evaluated family." The businessman watched the entire performance with growing indignation. These people were discussing the girl as if she were a technical problem to be solved, not a real child with genuine feelings and attachments. The second witness was even worse, a social worker who presented a devastating report on the inadequacy of the mansion's home environment. He described the excessive wealth as intimidating for a child from humble origins, the absence of traditional family structure as confusing for an already disoriented minor, and the occasional presence of business meetings at home as inappropriate exposure to adult stress. "Furthermore," continued the social worker, "there are concerns about the child's social isolation. She does not demonstrate healthy friendships with children of her own age and social class, preferring the exclusive company of the guardian, a pattern that indicates unhealthy emotional dependence." When it was the businessman's lawyer's turn to present his defense, the atmosphere in the room had already been poisoned by hours of testimony that painted a distorted but convincing picture of parental inadequacy. "Your Honor," began the lawyer, "what you have heard today is a coordinated campaign to remove a child from a loving and stable home based on speculative psychological theories and biases about non-traditional families." He presented the evidence they had gathered, medical reports showing the dramatic improvement in the girl's physical and emotional health, educational assessments demonstrating her accelerated cognitive development, and letters of recommendation from teachers and other professionals who had interacted with her. "This child is not being harmed by her current environment," argued the lawyer. "She is thriving. Her drawings show joy. Her teachers report exceptional progress, and anyone who spends time with her can see that she is loved and cared for." But the businessman could feel that something was wrong. The judge listened politely, but there was a decision already formed in his eyes. The questions he asked were pro forma, and his expressions suggested that he had already decided before the hearing even began. It was then that the lawyer played his strongest card, the evidence about the corruption of Marcus Villela and the network of institutions that profited from the unnecessary removal of children from their families. Your Honor, we have evidence that this petition is part of a fraudulent scheme where lawyers and childcare institutions collaborate to generate profits through the systematic removal of children from suitable homes. The room fell silent. Marcus Villela stood up immediately. Objection, Your Honor. These are unfounded and dramatic allegations intended to divert attention from the real issues at hand. We have complete documentation, insisted the businessman's lawyer, including financial records and communications that demonstrate— Enough, interrupted the judge, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. This court is not here to listen to conspiracy theories. We are here to determine what is best for a vulnerable child. The businessman felt the world crumbling around him. The judge not only refused to hear the evidence about the corruption, he dismissed it as if it were fantasies of desperate people. When the final arguments ended, the judge retired to deliberate. The businessman waited in the hallway with his lawyer, watching Marcus Villela and his stepmother converse in satisfied whispers on the other side. He had already decided before we started, murmured the lawyer, clear defeat in his voice. Whatever influence they have on him is substantial. When the judge returned, his face was a mask of professional gravity. After careful consideration of all the factors presented, he began, this court determines that there is sufficient evidence of risk to the minor's well-being to justify immediate removal from her current custody. The words hit the businessman like physical bullets. He clung to the table, trying to process what he had just heard. The minor will be placed immediately under the care of the St. Gabriel Child Rehabilitation Center, where she will receive specialized care while a more complete evaluation is conducted. The businessman knew the name. It was one of the institutions in which his stepmother was a silent partner, a place with a terrible record that had been carefully hidden through bribery and intimidation. Your Honor, attempted the lawyer, we request time to appeal this decision. The removal will be effected today, interrupted the judge. Representatives from the center are waiting to transport the minor. At that moment, the door of the room opened and two women entered, representatives from the institution that had just gained a new source of revenue in the form of an innocent child. The businessman stood up abruptly, all his instincts screaming to fight, to protect, to not allow them to take the girl who had become his daughter. But he was surrounded by the weight of the law, powerless against a system that had been corrupted from within. I have the right to at least say goodbye to her, he said, his voice breaking. The judge hesitated for a moment, perhaps feeling a pang of conscience. A brief farewell will be permitted under supervision. As the businessman was escorted through the cold hallways of the courthouse toward the car that would take him back to the mansion for the last time as the girl's father, he knew he had only one chance to save the child who had saved his life, and that chance depended on getting home before the institution representatives arrived there. Because he had learned that sometimes, when the system fails, the only option is to flee it completely. The race against time for his daughter's life was just beginning. The car cut through the metropolis traffic with desperate urgency, the businessman pressing the accelerator while his heart beat like a war drum in his chest. Beside him, the lawyer spoke rapidly on the phone, trying to organize last-minute legal resources, but they both knew they were racing against a clock that could determine the fate of an innocent child. How much time do we have? Asked the businessman, overtaking a slow truck with precise movements born of desperation. The institution representatives said they would arrive at the mansion in an hour, replied the lawyer, hanging up the phone. But considering the traffic, half an hour, concluded the businessman, mentally calculating the possible routes, maybe less. When they finally arrived at the mansion, they found a scene that confirmed the businessman's worst fears. Two official cars were already parked in front of the gates, and three dark-clothed women were talking to the stepmother on the main porch. Her smile was radiant, as if she were receiving guests for an elegant tea party instead of handing a child over to strangers. The businessman felt anger rise like lava in his veins, but he forced himself to remain composed. Exploding now would not help the girl. It would only give more ammunition to those who wanted to paint him as emotionally unstable. "Where is she?" he asked, approaching the group. "In her room, packing her bags," replied one of the institution representatives, a tall, thin woman with eyes as cold as ice. "We told her she was going to a special place where other children like her can play together." "Other children like her?" The businessman's voice was laden with a restrained fury that made the woman step back. "Children who need specialized care," she hastened to explain. "Children who have suffered trauma and need a structured environment to recover." The businessman ran up the stairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. He found the girl sitting on the edge of her bed, watching as the nanny placed her few clothes in a small suitcase. There was a resignation in her posture that broke his heart, the acceptance of a child who had learned too early that adults controlled her destiny in ways she couldn't influence. "Daddy," she said when she saw him, running into his arms. "The ladies said I have to leave now." He picked her up, feeling the small, familiar weight of her little body against his chest. "I know, sweetie. I know. Will you visit me at the new place?" The simple question was like a stab wound. He knew that visits would be controlled, limited, and eventually discouraged until the girl was relocated to a family that paid the proper fees to the institution. "I'll do everything I can," he promised, trying to keep his voice steady. At that moment, one of the representatives appeared at the door. "I'm sorry, but we need to leave now. There's a schedule to keep." "Just a few more minutes," pleaded the businessman. "Not possible. The transport is waiting." As they descended the stairs, the girl clinging to the businessman's neck as if it were an anchor in a storm, he observed the satisfied face of his stepmother. She had succeeded. After months of manipulation and sabotage, she had found a way to remove the only person who threatened her inheritance plans. "Make sure she is well taken care of," said the stepmother with false compassion, stroking the girl's hair. "It's for the best." The child cringed at the touch, her instincts still alerting her to the danger, even amidst the confusion of being torn from her home. It was when they arrived at the official car that the girl finally understood the magnitude of what was happening. She saw the strange women, the institutional-looking vehicle, and the finality of the farewell. Her eyes widened with pure terror. "No!" she screamed, clinging to the businessman with desperate force. "I don't want to go! Please, don't make me go!" The sound of her anguish echoed through the mansion courtyard like a cry from a wounded soul. The businessman felt something break inside his chest. Not just his heart, but something more fundamental, more primitive. All his protective instincts roared against the injustice of what he was witnessing. "Sir, we need you to hand her over now," said the lead representative, holding out her arms to take the child. "Daddy, don't let me go," cried the girl, her tears wetting his shirt. "Please, I promise to be better. I promise not to cause trouble." The words shattered any self-control that the businessman still maintained. Seeing that brave child, who had risked her life to save him, begging not to be abandoned again, was more than any decent human being could bear. "You're not going anywhere," he said suddenly, his voice laden with a determination that surprised everyone present. "Sir," said the representative, her voice gaining an edge of authority, "you are interfering with a court order. This could result in arrest." "Then arrest me," he replied, backing toward the house with the girl still in his arms. At that moment, his phone rang. It was the private investigator, and his first words changed everything. "I got it. I have irrefutable evidence of the corruption, including recordings of conversations between Marcus Villela and the judge." The businessman stopped abruptly. "Recordings?" "Phone conversations where they discuss payments in exchange for favorable rulings. I have documentation of financial transfers, and more importantly, I have a witness, a former employee of the institution willing to testify about the systematic mistreatment of the children." Suddenly, the businessman understood that he didn't need to run. He had something much more powerful, the truth, supported by evidence that no corrupt judge could ignore. "Keep holding the girl," said the lawyer who had overheard the phone conversation. "I'm going to make some urgent calls." During the next hour, a frantic legal battle unfolded on the phones and in the offices of the city. The investigator handed over his evidence to the federal prosecutors, who immediately opened an investigation into judicial corruption. The lawyer activated contacts in higher courts, arguing for an emergency stay of the removal order. Meanwhile, the businessman remained in the mansion with the girl, who gradually stopped crying as she realized that he wasn't going to hand her over without a fight. The institution representatives waited in the courtyard, making tense calls to their superiors and clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected resistance. "What's happening?" asked the girl, wiping her eyes with her small hands. "I'm fighting to protect you," he said, "like you did for me that day in the car." It was when the lawyer's phone rang with the call that would change everything. He answered, listened for a few minutes, and then smiled for the first time in weeks. "The order has been stayed," he announced. "A federal judge has issued an injunction preventing the removal of the child until the allegations of corruption are investigated." "What does that mean?" asked the girl, not understanding the complicated words, but sensing the change in tone. "It means you stay home," said the businessman, hugging her tighter. Outside, the institution representatives quickly got into their cars after receiving their own calls. The stepmother, in turn, had paled drastically as she realized that her carefully constructed plans were collapsing. "This is not over," she said, her mask of maternal concern finally slipping completely. "You may have won today, but there are other ways." "Actually," interrupted the investigator, who had arrived with a thick folder of documents, "it is over. We have enough evidence to not only reverse the decision about the child, but also to criminally prosecute everyone involved in the corruption scheme." The stepmother looked at the documents and then at the businessman, finally realizing that she had severely underestimated the man she had tried to destroy. "You have a choice," said the businessman, his voice as cold as Arctic ice. "You can voluntarily confess your involvement and perhaps receive a reduced sentence, or you can wait to be arrested when the federal prosecutors finish gathering all the evidence." For a long moment, she remained silent, weighing her options. Finally, realizing that the game was over and that she had lost completely, the mask she had worn for years finally fell. "You never understood," she said, her voice full of venom. "That child is nothing, just a threat to what you have built, to what our family has achieved through generations." "You're right about one thing," replied the businessman, looking at the girl who was sleeping peacefully in his arms, finally feeling safe again. "I never understood how anyone could look at this child and see anything other than a miracle." That night, after the stepmother was taken away by the authorities, and the mansion finally fell silent, the businessman put the girl in her bed and watched while she slept. Tomorrow there would be more paperwork, more legal procedures, more steps to make the adoption official and irreversible. But for now, it was enough to know that the girl who had saved his life was safe, and that finally, after months of silent war, they could begin to build the future they had always deserved. 6 months later, the mansion had transformed into something completely different from the cold and tense place it had been during the months of silent war. The walls seemed to breathe with a new lightness. The hallways echoed with sounds of genuine joy, and every room radiated the warmth of a real family that had finally found peace. The girl, now officially adopted and carrying the businessman's last name, had flourished in ways that surpassed even the most optimistic expectations. She had grown a few inches, her hair shone with health, and her big eyes no longer carried that constant watchfulness that had characterized her first months in the mansion. More importantly, her laughter had become a constant melody that filled the empty spaces that money had never been able to occupy. The businessman watched her that Saturday morning, playing in the garden with the boy from the blue house, who had become not only her best friend, but practically a brother. The two had created an elaborate world of imaginary adventures among the flowers and trees, where they were heroes saving people in danger. A game that unconsciously echoed the moment that had united father and daughter forever. "Daddy!" she shouted, running towards the porch where he was having coffee. "The neighbor wants to know if you can teach him about investments." The businessman laughed, a genuine laugh that had become more frequent in recent months. The boy from the blue house had developed a fascination with business after hearing conversations about stocks and Bitcoin, and constantly asked questions that demonstrated a surprising intelligence for his 4 years. "Maybe when you're a little older," he replied, picking up the girl as she reached the porch. "For now, focus on being kids." "But I want to learn about how you make money appear on the computer," she insisted, using her childish description for the digital financial markets. "Money doesn't magically appear," he explained patiently. "It takes a lot of study, hard work, and sometimes a little luck. Like when I found you in the car." The simple question moved him, as it always did when she made those innocent but profound connections. "Exactly like when you found me in the car." In those 6 months, many things had changed beyond the family dynamic. The corruption scandal that had been exposed through the investigations resulted in a complete cleansing of the local judicial system. Marcus Villela had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for fraud, corruption, and influence peddling. The judge who had ordered the removal of the girl was removed from office and also faced criminal charges. The network of corrupt institutions was closed, and dozens of children who had been incorrectly removed from suitable homes were reunited with their families. The St. Gabriel Child Rehabilitation Center was transformed into a genuine community resource center, administered by ethical professionals who truly cared about the well-being of the children. The stepmother, facing a sentence that could reach 20 years, had eventually confessed her involvement in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison and forced to return all the assets she had obtained through her fraudulent activities. The mansion, which was technically in her name through complex legal maneuvers, was returned to the businessman, along with other properties and investments she had tried to hide. But for the businessman, legal revenge was less important than the peace he had finally found. His company had thrived during the months of crisis, almost as if the universe was rewarding his prioritization of family over pure profit. His cryptocurrency investments had yielded extraordinary returns, and his diversified portfolio of international stocks continued to grow steadily. More importantly, he had found a balance between financial success and personal happiness that he had unknowingly sought throughout his adult life. Working to provide for his daughter gave his success a purpose that accumulating wealth for its own sake had never provided. "Daddy," said the girl, interrupting his thoughts, "do you remember when I lived on the street and had no one?" "I remember," he replied, always impressed with how she processed her personal history with a wisdom beyond her years. "Sometimes I'm afraid that it was a dream and that I'll wake up on the street again." The vulnerability in her voice moved him deeply. Even after months of safety and love, the child who had survived abandonment still carried scars that might never completely heal. "Want to know a secret?" he said, kneeling down to get to her height. "Sometimes I'm also afraid that this is a dream, afraid that I'll wake up and you won't be here." "Really?" "Really. But then I remember that dreams don't let you feel as much love as I feel for you. And dreams don't make you want to be a better person every day." The girl hugged him tightly, and he could feel the tension leaving her small body. It was one of the many conversations they had had about safety, permanence, and unconditional love. Conversations that a child therapist had recommended to help her process her fears of abandonment. That afternoon, they received a special visit. The private investigator who had exposed the corruption arrived with his wife and 2 young children, transforming the professional visit into a social event. The children played together in the garden while the adults talked about the progress of the legal proceedings and the long-term effects of the scandal. "You know you've become something of a local hero," said the investigator. "The story of the businessman who fought a corrupt system to protect his adopted daughter is inspiring other people to question suspicious judicial decisions." "I didn't do anything heroic," protested the businessman. "I just protected my family." "Exactly, and that's what makes it heroic." As he watched the children playing, the businessman reflected on how his definition of success had completely changed. Before, success meant growing net worth, corporate influence, and professional recognition. Now, success was the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing through the garden, the way she ran to hug him when he came home from work, and the quiet moments when she fell asleep in his arms during bedtime stories. His fortune in Bitcoin and international stocks continued to grow, but now it had a purpose beyond accumulation. He had established an educational fund for children who had gone through the adoption system, financed renovations in legitimate childcare institutions, and created scholarships for young lawyers interested in children's rights. "Daddy," said the girl, approaching with her latest drawing, "I made a portrait of our family." The drawing showed two figures holding hands, one tall and one small, surrounded by a giant heart. In the corner, she had written in her still childish handwriting, "Daddy and me forever." "It's perfect," he said, moved. "Let's put it on the refrigerator with the others." The mansion's refrigerator had become an informal art gallery, covered with dozens of drawings that documented the girl's emotional evolution. The first drawings, made during her most difficult days, showed solitary figures and dark landscapes. The most recent drawings exploded with vibrant colors, bright suns, and always, two figures together. That night, after the girl fell asleep, the businessman stayed in his office not working, but simply reflecting. 6 months ago, he had almost lost the most important thing in his life to people who saw children as financial commodities. Today, he had a real family and a purpose that went far beyond profit. His phone rang with a message from his secretary. Company shares rose 15% today, and cryptocurrency investments yielded another $1 million in profits. He looked at the message and smiled, but he didn't feel the emotion that such news used to provoke. Instead, he put away the phone and went upstairs to check if the girl was sleeping well. He found her sleeping peacefully, cuddling the teddy bear that had become her constant companion. Her hair was spread on the pillow like a golden halo, and there was a small but genuine smile on her lips, the smile of a child who knew she was safe and loved. "Thank you," he whispered, not knowing exactly who he was thanking. Perhaps the universe, perhaps the fate that had placed that brave child in his path on that fateful day. As he watched his daughter sleep, the businessman understood that he had found true wealth. It wasn't measured in dollars or euros, it didn't fluctuate with the stock or Bitcoin markets, and it couldn't be stolen by legal conspiracies or financial manipulations. It was measured in morning laughter, tight hugs, and the absolute trust of a child who had learned to believe in love again. It was a wealth that grew every day, that multiplied when shared, and that would make both of them richer than any monetary fortune ever could. And on that silent night, in a mansion that had finally become a true home, a businessman who had lost everything to gain what really mattered, and a girl who had saved a life and found a family, slept in peace, knowing that regardless of what the future held, they would face it together as father and daughter forever. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a score from 0 to 10. And thank you very much.